I don't have, can we please note the membership and the Chair and Vice Chair agreed at the annual meeting of the Council as set out above? Yep, agreed. Thank you. I don't have any apologies for absence. Are there any declarations of interest? No? The minutes of the meeting held on the 8th of February, are you happy that I sign them as a true and accurate record? Yes? Yeah, agreed. Thank you. Let me sign them. Thank you. What's next? The interim review of governance has been withdrawn, so we're on to changes to the Constitution and the scheme of delegation. So that is paper A6. Have I got that right? Yes. So paper A6. Do I have any comments? Anyone want to? Monica.
Excuse me, I had just a question about the interim review of governance. That's the independence governance review. Could you just tell us why it's been withdrawn and when we can expect it?
I think we expect it in September. They've done a review of the governance, but we thought we ought to be able to have time to respond to it in a sort of thoughtful way and then bring it to the admin committee to figure out whether that's appropriate or whatever. But we didn't have time before the papers went out. So rather than bringing it now and then bringing it, because we could have had it now and then we'd have to bring it back in September to figure out what our response would be. So we thought it best to do it all in one thing, bring it to admin committee in September, say, this is what was suggested, this is our response, and then discuss it as an entirety, and then take it to council to be discussed more broadly in council, rather than have an ad hoc sort of response.
It will come to us as a draft in September.
Yes.
Thank you.
Sorry, yes, I didn't mean to skip over it. That was just... So can we now look at A6? It's just for information. You can see the scheme of delegation. There are amendments to the scheme of delegation. The changes agreed in previous year are in the appendix. I'm just really asking you to note them, and then we'll then inform the council next week. So are there any questions, or should we just take these as noted? Okay, you to take silence as noted. Thank you. Paper A7, which is about the Pocklington Trust. Do you want to introduce it, Jackie?
Hello. Yes, I'm just bringing this back here. In 2019, we decided to suspend the awards being made because we had the interest had been significantly reduced due to the success, really, of the payments that we'd made to a high number of families and young people. I've been asked to bring this back, really just to consider where we're at in terms of the interest levels and whether we should reopen the applications. I think, as we can see from the paper, the interest is still relatively low, and of course we could tweak things one way or the other, but my one recommendation would be to wait, keep it closed until perhaps April next year, and then reintroduce it with a cap of the award and probably the number of awards that we can make each year. But we are working from a low base, so I just wanted to bring it back.
Thank you. Maxwell.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, I think what's proposed is quite a good idea, because you want to make use of the resources of that fund. I'm just curious, in terms of the 40 applicants you had since it's been closed, what were the largest and smallest amounts that were being asked for? And in terms of the cap of 1,000, what can you get which is meaningful for a student for that in terms of a diploma or obviously something smaller, much smaller in terms of maybe getting appropriate clothing for school, etc. So I'm just wondering how to make best use of that cap, that fund.
The requests are usually around perhaps low-income families where a young person has got a place in university or whatever. So really, the request is about some contribution to their maintenance. Sometimes we get very specific requests around a type of laptop or, piece of equipment, but mainly, I was looking back at the last few that we'd done. We were giving 2,000, a cap of 2,000 previously, and we'd nearly always give that amount. So it might be for fees towards private school, or it wasn't very often very specific. But we certainly did give some amounts, maybe £600 for a particular piece of equipment. But on the whole, those requests tend to be the maximum amount that they can apply for and towards sort of contribution to maintenance. The 40, I don't have a huge amount of information because we diverted them to other charities. We had some that have come back subsequently, so I don't know how those others, we closed it back in November 19, didn't we? So it's quite a long time. I could do some further research on that, but we'd probably only go back to those that have subsequently come back to us, if you see what I mean. I don't think we'd chase the 40.
Thank you. Kim?
Yes, thank you. So just a general question. What's the sort of long-term view on this fund? Because obviously if we're giving away more than we're getting in interest, eventually it's just going to disappear. So, is that the intention as far as this is concerned, that eventually it will go down to nil, or should we be looking at just awarding the interest or the income that comes from the fund and then keeping it going in perpetuity?
That's a good point.
I think historically, in 2017 when this fund was really looked at, I don't think that it was a surprise that we ran out of interest. It was calculated that we would use up those funds in the way that we did, and in fact I think it stretched further than we anticipated. I think it is a good point. We could simply just award 6,700 a year and be done with it. It's difficult. We'd have to wait a long time to build up the reserves to any sizable amount. So,
I'm sorry, I don't understand. And all I'm really advocating is that I don't know what the original intention of Pocklington and Mr. Thomas Huget, but my question is, you don't need to build up the reserves if you're just only spending and distributing the income. Eventually, you might consider that the 6,800 a year, with a cap is only 6 or 7 bequests, you might decide. But again, I still come back to the question: what's the intention? Should we keep this going in perpetuity in the memories of Pocklington and Huget, or should we just do as you're doing, which is continually awarding more than we're getting in income? Who makes that decision?
I don't actually have a view about that, really. Yes, sorry.
Okay, David?
I have a question.
Do you want to take your mask off when you're speaking, because otherwise it's practically impenetrable?
Of course. Are we allowed, if we so wanted, to distribute capital?
We put that to this meeting in November 19, and it was decided that we shouldn't eat into the capital.
What does the committee want to do? Do you want to have a report coming saying, these are our options, we could either spend it all and close it down because there are lots of other charities, or we could just say every year we'll only give out £6,871. But I guess Kim's thing is about what was the intention of the donation initially, we probably look at. Do you want to just bring it back with two options? Monica.
Sorry, coming to this for the first time, since this committee is trustees, I had a question about the actual criteria, because I noticed that it says there's been some help with school uniforms, and I know that's something that's very much needed. There are a couple of other charities, but it's quite a large demand at the moment, which isn't met. But looking back at the criteria under introduction point 2, it specifies it's outfits, clothing for boys or girls on leaving school in order to prepare for or assist for their entry into a profession. So I did wonder where the concept of school uniform had come from, and if it is a popular one, then trustees would need to make a change to those initial criteria, it would seem to me. And having decided on that, that would also make a difference, because I'm fairly supportive of what Kim is saying about 6,000 would keep it moving, and we do expect interest rates to go up a little bit. And it would also help us decide what were the key elements that we as trustees wanted to support. But as I'm reading it, it doesn't, school uniforms wouldn't come within the remit.
Jackie? Can you comment on that? Yeah, no, I don't think
If you
it's
read
provision of
paragraph 2 the
outfits
whole
to
way
enable boys
through.
and schools on leaving school, not at school.
Yep.
Can I just say, I don't think school uniforms is a huge ask of this charity. It's usually maintenance, support to assist low-income young people who are attending college or university.
Okay. So are you saying, Monica, that you think we ought to be stricter in our interpretation, and that if people come asking for a school uniform, as it's not laid out in these provisions, that we suggest they go to another charity who can provide the money?
I think we have to be clear as trustees of what the criteria is that we are holding on to as a legacy, and the importance of school uniform. Certainly, if I had known about this, there are so many people sending a couple of children to a school where they have to change uniform almost each year because of size, etc., that there would be a demand on this, I think, if more people knew about it. So perhaps it does mean there needs to be a stricter look at the criteria and how this legacy grant is spent.
I guess, actually, for the next meeting, we just need to figure out whether we think it should continue, whether we should just... There's so little money left. The question is whether we either stop, and let the amounts come up again, or we do as Kim says and just hand out 6,000 a year, or we go for a big bang and say, right, well, let's just spend it till it's done, and then that's the end of the funds. So I think we should look at each option, and at the same time look at the criteria. Does that sound like a sensible way forward? And then in the next meeting we come to a decision. Okay. Oh, hold on, no.
Thank you. 1.1, the introduction, the second point, explains that this fund is enable boys and girls on leaving school, universities. Does that mean you would be helping school leavers and youngs who didn't finish they are not intended to finish in their education, they might start a business?
I'm sorry, could you clarify that? I couldn't hear properly.
School leavers, I know one of your aims is to help those who are staying in education. But again, you are stating that leaving school, girls and boys who are leaving school. Does that mean who are quitting studying, they might try other ways to starting a business? They need help by building a website, or they might need a laptop or advertisement. Is this included?
So I think what we're asking is if you're leaving school, if you could just clarify in 1.2 again on the criteria, is it just for children who are going on for higher education, or does it help people if they're going into trade or something by giving them a computer or something that they might need? Is that what you're asking? And I think the answer is yes, it does, because it says to enable boys and girls on leaving school to assist their entry into a trade or a calling. So yes, it does. Am I right?
Yes, I mean, we've hardly ever had anything. I think the reason I'm struggling with this is I'm not sure we've ever had those sorts of requests in the time I've been involved, which is 2 or so years. I'm happy to have a look to see what the bulk of requests are, so we get a clear idea.
That'd be helpful.
Yeah, but yes, I can quite see that somebody might come to us and ask for equipment, for plumbing or something, you know, help towards. I can imagine that a request like that could be made, but I'm not familiar with any having been made.
Thank you. But it still comes back to the fact that there's only £6,000 a year to hand out, right? So it's very few, very little. Okay, so we're happy that it comes back next time, and we just have a look at what the intentions were of the people who set up the charity and make a decision as to whether we run it down or we keep it and just give out the interest every year, and at the same time look at the criteria. Thank you. Agreed. Right, and our final paper, which is probably the most substantive one, is paper A8, which is talking about people coming back to work, whether we're having, you know, hybrid meetings, hybrid way of working, how our whole workforce goes about things in the next period, how we encourage them to come back to work and how we retain them while they're here. So Barry, do you want to introduce it?
Yes, if I could. The reason why this issue is here is because employers are the people who are charged with responsibility about work arrangements once we move into step 4. And as you all know, the Prime Minister is announcing at 5 o'clock the headlines on this, and it could be that we get some guidance or the rescinding of previous guidance later on this evening. And so I thought it was really important that we brought the issue here. Because when employers make the decision, in our case in local government, it's the council that makes the decision. And obviously, what we've been looking at is it was quite easy to make a decision that people could suddenly work from home if they were able to, and if we could provide sufficient support and technological support to enable them to. What we didn't realise at the time was how long that was going to be. We had no sense of the length of that time. And we've had some engagement with staff and with trade unions during this period. And we've surveyed staff about their intentions. But whenever we've asked these questions, of course, no one's known when the end is going to be. And people's response is always, well, it all depends. And so we were initiating, we haven't yet done this, we'll probably send this tomorrow or the following day after this consideration here, a survey of all of our staff who and ask them about the both their concerns, their impediments, but also the prospects, the opportunities that they may have in changing their work pattern. It would seem that the majority of organisations that provide professional services are really retaining as much working from home as is feasible. The issue is different for us because we provide local services and we provide them locally. Now we've had 500 or so staff working from the locations every day. We just have about 1,800 to 1,900 that are not, that are working remotely or who come in from time to time, or who come in on a 1, 2, 3 day a week basis. And the issue is, this is a pattern now that's quite strong. It's also a pattern that's undermined by the actuality of commuting in London and what that means for authorities like ours. So authorities like ours and Westminster and Camden are probably most of the people who live outside. That's not unusual because most of the people that work in the private sector in Kensington and Chelsea live outside. But the issue really for us is how do we manage the short term from moving from the arrangement that we have now into enabling a return to work, and the advantages of all that are set out in the report in terms of the much better in-person interaction, the much better collaboration that there is, the much better innovation, and also the fact that people need to know the borough, the place of the borough, the communities of the borough in which they live. It may not be that they return to the office so much as they return to Kensington and Chelsea. Otherwise, they're going from one socially isolated environment into another one where they're socially immersed, but only with people who come from other socially isolated environments. So we need to plan in with this a very strong issue of acquainting people with the realities of the borough. Last Friday, we had a whole senior management in-person conference here. And of the people that were there, I think there's 25, 28 people, 6 of them at least had joined since last March. And 3 of them, no, I think it was more than 7, I think 7 or 8 of them had joined since last March. And so they actually hadn't had the opportunity of engaging with the authority other than through the wonders, the liberating and debilitating in equal measure wonders of Microsoft Teams. And so I think the opportunities of us re-establishing a socially connected, a socially purposeful organisation is much more likely when people are back at work. The issue is how do we manage that, and how do we manage it in the shorter term, bearing in mind the fact that we're looking also at the longer term transitions, because the way of working in any event was moving in that direction. This has just amplified it considerably. And I think that the entire approach really should be one which is a learned approach, where we learn with the employers, where the employers learn with employees, not just about preferences, but about what works best for services. We're not here just balancing the preferences of employers and the preferences of employees. Of course, there's many employees now that their circumstances have changed somewhat dramatically since they were, excuse me, since they were here, working here full time, and particularly in relation to children at school. If they've got children at school, been homeschooling, or if there are issues essentially about the children having to self-isolate. Now we're also at another, and so we need to decide all this and move in that direction, which is why we said we should start this from next week and really take that period up until early September when the schools return for bedding in new arrangements about returning to work here at Kensington and Chelsea, and encouraging staff and showing opportunities for that, and making sure that we connect people back to place, not just back to institution and office, because I think that's fundamental. The question, I think, the longer term question really is about the vitality of the central activity zone itself. As I put in the notes, the vast majority, 9 in 10 of all workers in Westminster are private sector workers. 5 in 6 of all the workers in Kensington and Chelsea are private sector workers. So what happens in the private sector in relation to people basically gathering in workplaces, again, is fundamental to the central activity zone returning to being a vibrant activity place for people to gather socially, culturally, after work as well as in work. And if we find that that actually in 2 months' time, lots of people are returning back to work, then that will, I think, will encourage more and more people back into the centre. Because what we've had really is a sort of centrifugal effect in London, with more people staying out in their suburbs, working from their homes rather than coming in. Now, I've put here the information from TfL, which is that the bus passenger network transports up to over 60% of pre-pandemic levels, underground over 40% of pre-pandemic levels. But there's still, as extreme, does depend where you're going. If you go into the city, you'll find it's still at 15% of pre-pandemic levels. Because office workers in the city really have not returned at all. So I think the longer term question to us is what will this do about the character of work, the nature of organisations, and our ability to retain talented staff and to recruit talented staff. And I think that's very much a question of us working in concert with other local authorities. So what I've suggested here in the recommendations, and these are, and look, I put them as recommendations for this committee to consider to go to the council in September, but my guess is that before then there'll be much more water under many more bridges because things are literally changing weekly. But I thought it would be wrong for this committee not to see the current thinking about the direction of travel. Of course, the rising number of the rising infection rates, the case rates, are of concern. They're at 32,000 at the moment. But as I put in the report, there does appear to be a substantive break in the link between case rates and hospitalisation as well as mortality. So although there were 32,000 people infected as of yesterday, the average death rate was 26 a day. When it was 32,000 in December, the average death rate was 470 a day. The government said, the Secretary of State for Health has said, it's possible that the infection rates could go as high as 100,000. Now, if it goes that high, the issues really will be about the proportion of the people that are infected but not vaccinated, which will principally be the much younger population, the extent to which their health will or will not be impacted by this, and whether there's any stronger mutations between now and then. And so there still does remain these contingent concerns that are health concerns, but I think you need to be assured that we're working very vigilantly with our public health colleagues on these issues, and that when we're looking at, for example, the safety of our office environment, we're looking at issues of ventilation, of cleaning, of office design, of the numbers of mask wearing, again, issues of mask wearing, I think may well be announced this evening. And we need to do that in the round with a range of different professionals, but principally led by our public health. So I just felt I ought to explain that and answer any questions.
So Barry, what you're saying, this paper is really a direction of travel.
Very much so.
And it would come to council not next week, but in September.
Yes.
Because in September, we'll probably have to come back to admin committee again, or not. Yeah.
Because I feel if it went next week, we'd probably be changing it
Anyway,
2 weeks later.
Yeah. So in a way, it's almost like a sort of for information paper to say this is the way that you're thinking, and these are the parameters, and this is how we get people to either come to work in Kensington and Chelsea or stay working in Kensington and Chelsea, and get that balance between them being here because they have critical jobs and they need to be embedded in the locality, and then also their preferences to whether they want to be here or not. It's that, isn't it?
I think it's more their circumstances than their well, preferences and circumstances.
Okay, preferences and yeah. Okay, yes, you're right.
Because the other issue is otherwise everyone would prefer their 2 days to be Tuesday and Wednesday.
Yeah. Maxwell.
I work in HR in a bank, so I'm very aware of this sort of challenge of getting people to come to the office, but also being flexible as an employer. My bank was very much a bumps on seats culture pre-pandemic, so rolling out laptops en masse to join us obviously was a challenge. But I think what's also interesting is culture. I'd be curious to know how many joiners you've had since the pandemic, because we get joiners, and then when a rare time they are in the bank, it's like, oh wow. Oh, this is this head of this department. I've never actually met you, in real life. So I guess I'd be curious to know, I say, how many joiners you've had since the start, because obviously those who've joined in flexible working circumstances would be more happy, I guess, to continue with that, whereas staff who were used to coming here before might think, oh, actually, I prefer to come back. But then again, they may have families, they may have other commitments. The other thing I'm wondering about is in terms of the department split. So, for example, go back to my bank as a case study, our branch cannot work remotely. You can't be a cashier remotely. So I'm curious what parts of the council literally cannot be done remotely, whereas what departments actually it's very much open and actually potentially, I'm not saying it would be better, but it can be performed just as well as home.
Well, in terms of, I can give you approximate numbers on we think there's been well over 100 joiners that are completely new to the organisation. I do corporate induction every month. I would say there's at least, I'd say maybe, some of the corporate induction also for people that are moving internally. So it's between 100 and 200 new joiners. As I say, when we met a senior management group, there were at least 7 or 8 people who had joined in the last year. Some of whom, like one person, I said, oh, I thought you were much taller than that. I hadn't seen them in person. It was just interesting. I assumed this guy was 6'4". I don't know why I had it in my head. So there's, and I think when you do have that social interaction in person, particularly with people, I think it's feasible to carry on an in-person a connection, not in person, remotely, with people who you've worked with for some time before. It's also possible if the role that you've got is very technical or professional. So the areas where the research has been done on, where there's, it's in high innovation areas, academics, or probably the occupational sectors which are most able to cope with this is academia and also journalism, where people essentially are writing a thing and it's been sort of sub-edited at a distance and then collected together and so on. We don't have very many people in that sort of area. Our professional groups tend to want to discuss one with another about the sort of risks. So, for example, in social work, children's social work, yes, they can do a lot of that work remotely, but actually there is also the basis of making sure that they're managing risk within their profession as much as risks of the children. But in terms of those staff who have been working and are working continually, it's children's social care, adult social care, care for the vulnerable. You do need in-person connection. Housing management and housing repairs, for example. Some of the planning roles and trading standards and environmental health, not just those that have been working on the COVID response, but others because they need to visit facilities. The job can't be done without visiting facilities. But still, nonetheless, 75 to 80% are working principally remotely, although we're reviewing this now, trying to check the numbers again. And so I think that we sort of know what the position is, but we really don't know the contribution of in-person social interaction in different professional settings, because we're a multi-purpose organisation doing very many different functions, and what works in, well, even in children's social care differs from adult social care, differs from public health. And so we need to make approaches which are specific to the service needs of the service users to make sure that our functional responsibilities are carried forward, but also that they're pertinent to the place-based requirements of us as a planning authority.
Just a follow-up, in terms of, did you have any entirely remote joiners? I had a couple at my bank, which I tried to resist, but in the end we had to give in because of there's do shielding in terms of being vulnerable. And then I guess the survey you mentioned, what's going to be the content of the survey? What sort of questions are you hoping to ask?
It's very brief, and it's about people's how they've been working. and what concerns, impediments there would be for them returning to work on a 1, 2, 3 day a week basis, how we could help support them with that, and the conversation they've had with their line manager about those issues. Some of which are technical and some are about health problems, well-being.
Thank you, Barry. Kim, you wish to ask something?
Yes, so a couple of questions, Barry. So first of all, can I just say I'm really comforted when you say what's best for services, rather than what necessarily is best for either council or employees. And I suppose the question that comes from that, and you've explained the survey, so I don't need to answer that, is to what extent do we have existing analysis of productivity, or what additional analysis we might have? I know obviously within certain sections of the council, things like call, where we've got call centres and call monitoring, we get evidence about when the timing of calls and how long it takes to respond, and that's something we can have as a KPI. So I think, you know, to what extent are we going to ensure that, because 87% is quite a surprisingly high figure of people saying that we feel we're more productive, as it says in your report. And I know initially I thought I was being more productive because I had back-to-back Teams meetings, and I thought, oh God, I've got more meetings today, but I'm not sure it was more productive. So I think that was my first question. And the second element is really to do with risk, because again, within the report, we talk about having a risk assessment, preparing the office, and the importance of that in terms of the individual to minimise that risk. But do we consider what the home risk is in terms of individuals and when they're working from home, and whether or not they're working in a risky environment, we're putting at greater risk? That might be that here we are worrying about issues of isolation within our cafe and exclusion, and maybe that's more relevant in terms of being home. So those are the two general areas: risk and assessment of people's productivity. Thank you.
Well, I think it was a long time ago that I believed that attending a meeting was somehow productive. Because essentially I'm only in meetings that coordinate the coordinators. And so I sort of often feel that people can get involved in a sort of hamster wheel of meetings, which actually reduces their productivity. If meetings are a series of monologues, they're not really there's not really any creative exchange at all, but because of the need in local government to coordinate, the one hand making sure that the other hand's doing the same thing at the same time, it does mean that it's ever so easy. And I personally believe that the Teams environment created over coordination. I think you can coordinate too much because people, I can't believe that all these people needed to be in all these meetings that I was on all the time. So there is this, people need a self-denying ordinance not to be on Teams meetings, I think, sometimes. But the question really is about the fundamental question is about, have these tools improved our productivity? Well, I do think they enabled us to continue with services in a way that we wouldn't have done before. That was extremely good because we were able to check and to literally check and chase and harry and make sure and coordinate and make sure that work was done. So we were able to continue with services and start new ones, it has to be said. As to what it's done with overall productivity, that's made up of individuals' productivity, aggregated. It's also team-based productivity. But productivity in local government is sort of inputs to outputs. We're actually looking at longer term outcomes. And we often say when we're like commissioning services, that's the cost of this for the cost effectiveness, bearing in mind the outcomes. I think that what this is raising an awful lot of sectors, not just the public sector, is how do we go about measuring product? Because we don't have agreed measures of productivity. At best, we have measures of comparative efficiency, one authority with another. How much do we spend for the service outcomes that we've got? We've done that in the last 2 years ago, looked at that. But I do think that this will raise questions about whether people are more productive, whether more productive when they're together or when they're separated. And I think it will fundamentally come down to the nature and character of their work. And so I think it puts an onus on managers in organisations to be really clear, big role clarity. There's too many times that we have create roles and there's a crowded goalmouth. There's too many roles of overlapping responsibilities. And when you then ask these people to coordinate amongst themselves, then that can be unproductive. So I think we're going to look, and this is what we've been doing, of our DMA process, which is the process of looking at the levels of what's actually this manager responsible for, and what's that one responsible for, and the one underneath. These are really important questions, because management must be an added value to the people that do work on the front line. If it's not adding any value, it's just merely coordinating, then it's not adding to productivity. But productivity is service outcomes. It's not just numbers of widgets, literally the outcomes for the people who live here, because that's the paramount thing. That's why we're here.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up on some things around preference. I thought this was a very helpful report. And as you say, members have to be seen to be taking certain decisions in the public realm. And I think it's interesting that being on Portobello Road as the centre of my ward, during lockdown, I've got to know certain departments and certain officers far better than I ever did before, and others not at all. And it does often come down to department, but as well, personal choice. So one of the things I hope will be in this report when it comes to members in September is I think we need some guidelines on expectations we have of officers, because I do feel there has been a lot of productivity when we've all refused a Teams meeting, but when we've met on site as usual and something has happened. But that's been limited to the personalities, in a sense, and the preferences of certain officers, and I think that's got to be respected. But so we're struggling through at the moment via Zoom meetings monthly, attempts to lead a co-design process for the improvements in Powis Square. And certainly as a member and the resident steering group want to get back to face-to-face meetings in a large room as safely as we can, but as soon as possible, because the dynamics and the ability on a Zoom meeting to actually mess up any progress is extreme. So I think that as a member, I know that living in Colville, I would be saying, oh, let's have an on-site, let's do this in the open. Now that's quite a lot of expectations from an officer who lives some way away from Kensington and Chelsea. So I wondered what your thinking was on that, because characteristically I think that on-sites often are more productive. And I know I'm dealing now with perhaps some newer officers who don't actually know the place, as you say. But also that I've got to be very aware of all officers' personal circumstances and preferences and their own personal risks. So I would welcome, I think we all would, some sort of guidelines that would make officers feel more confident to say, no, I don't think that's appropriate, or for members to know when it was or wasn't appropriate.
Excuse me. I start on the basis that it's the service needs and the needs of solving things in situ, in location, that comes first. And that we need to work to a position where we can make sure that that's being attended to by officers. So yes, I think something was about expectations would be really important, because I concede that I don't believe we should be saying, well, it's the preference of some of our officers not to attend these things. I don't actually accept that.
I would agree with you, but I also think it's not a member's position.
No, it's not.
So
No.
it's going to be a sensitive one, and
It is.
has
It
to be
is.
respected on both sides.
Yes, and as I say, in local government, it's actually, people are employees of the council. They're not as they would be in, say, New Zealand, where they'd be employees of the chief executive. It's when people are employees of the council, so they're council employees. They're not, and they are servants of the public, and that can't be done. Obviously, in a crisis that we're in, and the way that we're working, and we want to move to new ways of working that could be much more cost-effective to the authority. And if that could be by more people working remotely, then that's great. At the moment, though, we only have, I think it's about 30 staff who are employed on a home working basis. They tend to be staff working in revenues and benefits, on customer service. They've worked for many years on that basis, and they provide a really good service. And maybe there's some service areas like that we should be providing more. It could go from 30 to 100 or something. It could be that in other areas we're looking at most people being full-time, and other people being 2 to 3. The issues for us is often what the banks are doing are looking to reduce their headcount so that they can reduce their office space and therefore their asset base, therefore make a saving. If we were doing that, we would draw everyone into the Kensington Town Hall. That would be the opposite of what we're trying to achieve. And so I think we need to be thinking much more about where is the...
Nah. I think I pressed something. Hmm? Do I press it again? I've censored Barry.
It's
okay,
working
come back.
now.
It's working.
Could I just come back then with one
Can I say,
point
what a great button.
That was you, was it? That's like on a Zoom meeting when you get muted. Right. I just, yes, that's why I also wanted to add that I found people in departments that usually perhaps wouldn't have so many external meetings very happy to meet in public places and open air and parks, etc. And I wondered whether it was a time to review something we looked at around the governance of sort of having more outreach areas, and particularly then we talked about relevant people being based in North Kensington, or people coming not from home to open air locations, or coming to outreach locations, so that people don't get to know the town hall very well between September and December. And I know you're arranging staff induction, and I'm sure I'll be very happy, as will others, to facilitate that. But we talked a lot in governance about decentralisation, didn't we? And there wasn't much of an appetite then, but for sort of placing people in our different hubs. And I would just say I hope that maybe that can be considered so that new people don't get too attached to their one office in the town hall.
I think, after we've looked at this work, it makes sense to look at our buildings, doesn't it? Because everything's going to change. I think this paper's really just the next 3 to 6 months. But after that, of course, you will have to look at everything. But I think Barry is absolutely right. We've got to start with the service. You know, what service are you providing? And you're right that quite a lot, you need to have on-site meetings. You can't have an off-site meeting for everything, because you need to be able to sort of sniff the air and feel the bones. And, if you're a planning officer or you're licensing, you need to get out there. And as Barry said, it's not your preference, your circumstances. So it's quite a lot to weigh up, isn't it? And this is the first attempt. So are there any other questions? Because on the subject of governance going out to different areas, we've got our Chelsea Forum tonight. So, there are quite a few of us here are Chelsea councillors. Okay, if there's nothing else, can we accept the recommendations in paragraph 2, please? Agreed. Thank you very much. Is there any other business? No? Thank you all for coming.